Tonight, we step into a world of controlled chaos where probability masquerades as luck and mathematics wears the costume of chance. Before the chips fall and the wheel spins, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you're genuinely interested in what we do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what your local time is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Phone face down, volume low. Let's walk through these neon-lit doors together. In the beginning, there was the bone. Not metaphorically, literally. 6,000 years ago, in the dust of ancient Mesopotamia, someone picked up the ankle bone of a sheep, the astragalus, and discovered that it had 4 distinct sides on which it could land. It was nature's first die, a gift from anatomy. They called these bones knucklebones, and they were cast not just for entertainment, but for divination. The future, it seemed, could be read in how the bones fell. The gods spoke through randomness, or perhaps, more accurately, humans learned to see patterns in chaos and called it divine will. This was the birth of something profound. Not gambling, not yet, but the recognition that uncertainty could be ritualized, that the unknown could be confronted through a deliberate act of submission to chance. The Egyptians had their own version, carved ivory and stone into more regular shapes. The Greeks and Romans refined the craft, creating the tesserae, the 6-sided cube we recognize as dice today. But it was always more than a game. It was a conversation with fate itself. The Romans, pragmatic even in their vices, loved gambling with a passion that bordered on religious fervour. Dice games were everywhere, from the marble floors of patrician villas to the muddy streets where soldiers crouched between campaigns. They bet on everything: dice, chariot races, gladiatorial combat, animal fights. The Emperor Augustus was known to lose spectacular sums in a single evening. Caligula, that monument to excess, reportedly had men executed when he needed funds to cover his gambling debts. Claudius wrote a book about dice games. Nero bet the equivalent of kingdoms. But Rome, for all its enthusiasm, also recognized the danger. Gambling was technically illegal for most citizens during most of the Republican Empire, except during the festival of Saturnalia, that week-long December bacchanal, when all social rules were temporarily suspended. The law was routinely ignored, of course. Gambling dens, the koponai, operated in the shadows of every city, protected by bribes and the understanding that certain human appetites could not be legislated away. They could only be managed, controlled, and taxed when the state was clever enough to do so. The medieval period brought a curious development. The Christian Church, which had inherited Rome's ambivalence about gambling, officially condemned it as a sin, a manifestation of greed and a dangerous flirtation with demonic forces that controlled random outcomes. Yet knights returning from the Crusades brought with them new games from the Islamic world, cards and dice games of Byzantine complexity, and the church itself, pragmatically, was not above using lotteries to raise funds for cathedrals and monasteries. God's will, it seemed, could be profitably expressed through the drawing of lots, as long as the house was the house of God. By the Renaissance, gambling had evolved from scattered dice games in back rooms into something more organized, more architectural. Venice, that republic of merchants and masks, gave the world its first true casino. The word itself is Italian, a diminutive of casa, meaning house. But in Venetian dialect, a casino was a small villa, a pleasure house, a place set aside for entertainment. In 1638, the Venetian government, displaying the kind of forward-thinking pragmatism that had made the city wealthy, established the ridotto. The ridotto was not a den, it was a palace. Located in the wing of the Palazzo Dandolo, it was a government-sanctioned gambling house, designed to provide controlled gaming during the carnival season. It was an explicitly political creation. Venice was awash in private, unregulated gambling houses where wealthy patricians were losing fortunes to professional gamblers and card sharps. The ridotto was meant to bring order to chaos, to regulate the vice, to ensure that the games were honest, or at least honestly rigged in favour of the house. It was a revolutionary concept. Legitimized gambling as a civic institution. The rules were strict. Only nobility and wealthy merchants could enter. Players had to wear masks, a requirement that added an intoxicating layer of anonymity and mystery. The games on offer were primarily biribi and basetta, ancestors of modern roulette and baccarat. The house took a percentage of every pot. The Ridotto was an instant success, and for over a century, it was the most famous gambling establishment in Europe. It proved a concept that would echo through the centuries. Gambling, when properly organised and aesthetically packaged, was not just profitable, it was respectable, but even legitimised vice has its limits. In 1774, the Venetian authorities, concerned about the moral decay of the aristocracy and the massive fortunes being lost at the tables, closed the Ridotto. It was a temporary victory for morality. The appetite it had cultivated did not disappear. It merely scattered, proliferating into hundreds of smaller, less regulated establishments throughout Europe. The genie, once released, would not return to the bottle. Across the English Channel, a different model was emerging. Bath, and then London, became centres of fashionable gambling in the 18th century. The difference was one of class and presentation. While the Ridotto had been a state enterprise, English gambling operated in a grey zone of aristocratic clubs and private homes. Crockford's, established in 1828 by a former fishmonger named William Crockford, was the pinnacle of this world. It was not technically a public casino. It was a gentleman's club where gentlemen happened to lose staggering sums of money. Crockford was a genius of what we would now call customer experience. The club was designed by the finest architects. The dining room served the best French cuisine in London. The decor was sumptuous, the staff was impeccable, and the games, primarily hazard, an ancestor of craps, were conducted with a theatrical seriousness that gave the whole enterprise an air of legitimacy, even grandeur. Crockford himself made a fortune estimated at over £1 million, a staggering sum in the 1830s, essentially by providing a beautiful, comfortable space where wealthy men could systematically destroy their inheritances. The model was clear. Gambling was not about the games. It was about the experience, the environment, the illusion that one was participating in something sophisticated, something exclusive. The house did not need to cheat. It merely needed to provide an atmosphere that encouraged play, excellent odds that ensured the house would always win in the aggregate, and enough occasional winners to keep the dream alive. Then came the 19th century, and with it, two transformative developments, the railroad and the spa town. Suddenly, wealthy Europeans could travel with unprecedented ease, and they began to congregate in seasonal migrations to places with mineral springs, mountain air, and most importantly, gambling. The Germans pioneered this model with Baden-Baden and Wiesbaden, spa towns that added casinos as an amenity, a form of medicinal entertainment. You came for the waters, stayed for the roulette. But the true cathedral of 19th century gambling, the place that would define the aesthetic and the philosophy of the casino for the next 150 years, was built on a rocky promontory on the Mediterranean coast, a place that did not exist as anything but a sleepy fishing village until a desperate prince made a desperate gamble. That place was Monte Carlo. In 1856, Prince Charles III of Monaco had a problem. His tiny principality, squeezed between France and the sea, was broke. He had no resources, no industry, no prospects. His subjects were leaving, his coffers were empty, and then someone suggested the unthinkable: legalize gambling, build a casino, turn vice into virtue or at least revenue. The first attempts were disasters. The initial casino, opened in 1856, was a grim little establishment in a grim little building. Almost no one came. The roads were terrible. There was no train service. It was a failure. But in 1863, Prince Charles granted a concession to a French businessman named François Blanc, who had made a fortune running casinos in Bad Homburg, Germany, before that conservative state, in a fit of morality, banned gambling. Blanc was not just a casino operator. He was a visionary. He understood that a casino was not a building, it was a dream. He poured a fortune into infrastructure, building roads, bribing the French government to extend the railway line from Nice to Monaco, and most importantly, designing a palace. The Casino de Monte Carlo, which opened its doors in stages between 1863 and 1878, was unlike anything the world had seen. It was designed by Charles Garnier, the same architect who had built the Paris Opera. It was a confection of Belle Époque excess, marble and gilt, frescoes and chandeliers, a building that announced, from the moment you saw it, that this was not a place for ordinary people living ordinary lives. Blanc's genius extended to the business model. He banned Monaco citizens from gambling in the casino, a policy that remains to this day. This had two effects. It protected the local population from ruin, and more importantly, it reinforced the idea that the casino was exclusively for visitors, for the international elite. He also abolished the house tax. Monaco would become a tax haven, attracting the wealthy from across Europe. They would come for the tax advantages, stay in the luxury hotels Blanc built, and gamble in his casino. It was a vertically integrated empire of leisure and vice. The money poured in. Within 2 decades, the casino was generating so much revenue that Prince Charles was able to abolish all direct taxation on Monaco's citizens. The entire state was now funded by the willingness of wealthy foreigners to lose money at roulette and baccarat. It was, in effect, a voluntary tax on the rich and foolish, administered through the elegant mathematics of the house edge. Monte Carlo became the playground of Europe. Russian Grand Dukes lost fortunes there. English lords, French counts, Italian industrialists all made the pilgrimage. The casino's reputation was carefully cultivated through a brilliant public relations strategy. Stories of spectacular wins and losses were fed to newspapers across Europe. The Suicide Garden, a manicured patch of greenery outside the casino where ruined gamblers supposedly ended their lives, became a macabre tourist attraction, though the actual number of suicides was far lower than legend suggested. The myth was more profitable than the truth. The games themselves were refined to an art. Roulette, which had been played in various forms since the 18th century, was perfected in Monte Carlo. Blanc, or possibly his sons, introduced the single zero wheel, reducing the house edge and making the game more appealing to sophisticated players who understood odds. Baccarat, that ancient game of chance, was elevated to a ritual of high-stakes drama, played in hushed private rooms behind velvet ropes. These were not games. They were performances, theatrical presentations of chance dressed in the costume of sophistication. The aesthetic of Monte Carlo became the template for every casino that followed. The message was clear. Gambling was not a vice. It was a luxury experience, a sophisticated adult entertainment for people of means and taste. The house was not taking your money. It was providing you with a service, an experience, a story you could tell. The beautiful rooms, the impeccable service, the presence of royalty and celebrities, all of it combined to create a powerful psychological fiction. That the casino was not a business designed to extract money from you, but a glamorous stage on which you were the star. And in a sense you were. The casino understood something profound about human psychology, something that no one had yet articulated in scientific terms, but which every successful gambling house had discovered through centuries of trial and error. People do not gamble to win money. They gamble to experience the possibility of winning money, the anticipation, the hope, the momentary suspension of ordinary reality. That is the product. The casino is not selling games. It is selling hope, and hope, as it turns out, is the most profitable commodity in the world. But even as Monte Carlo reached its zenith, as the Belle Époque glittered and European aristocrats waltzed their way toward the catastrophe of the Great War, a very different kind of gambling culture was emerging across the Atlantic. America, young, raw, and restless, had its own relationship with chance, one that was less aristocratic and far more democratic, which is to say, far more dangerous. Gambling in America was born on the move, on the riverboats that plied the Mississippi and its tributaries in the early 19th century, floating palaces of steam and wood that carried cotton, timber, and passengers between the plantations of the South and the commercial hub of New Orleans. These boats were not just transportation. They were mobile communities, and like all communities, they had their vices. Professional gamblers, often called sharpers or card sharps, made these boats their hunting grounds. These were not the elegant croupiers of Monte Carlo. These were con men, many of them brilliant mathematicians and psychologists, who made their living through a combination of skill, deception, and intimidation. The games were poker, 3-card Monte, Faro, all games where a clever operator could tilt the odds dramatically in his favour through sleight of hand, marked cards, or rigged equipment. The stakes were often everything a man owned. Fortunes in cotton futures, land deeds, even slaves changed hands over a table in a smoky salon, while the paddle wheel churned through the brown water. The riverboat gambler became an American archetype, romanticised in literature and later in film. But the reality was grittier. These men lived by their wits in a violent, lawless environment. cheating was common. Discovery was often fatal. Many a gambler who pushed his luck too far ended the night at the bottom of the Mississippi with a knife in his ribs or a bullet in his head. It was the free market taken to its logical, brutal extreme. Caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware, except the product was a rigged game and the price was ruin. As America expanded west, gambling went with it. The mining camps and frontier towns of the gold rush era were soaked in vice. Saloons served as banks, brothels, and casinos, often all in the same rough wooden building. Gambling was not an entertainment. It was an economic institution. Miners who had spent months in freezing streams panning for gold would come to town and lose their entire stake in a single night of poker or faro. The saloon owners and professional gamblers were often the wealthiest men in these communities, extracting the gold that the miners had extracted from the earth. The games were often crooked, but that was understood. In a world without law, without regulation, without any authority beyond the gun, the idea of a fair game was almost quaint. What mattered was that you had a chance, however slim, however rigged. That possibility, that maybe tonight you would be the one who walked away rich, was enough to keep men coming back. Hope, again, was the product. And in the American West, hope was in infinite demand. By the late 19th century, as America urbanized, gambling moved indoors and upscale. Cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco had developed their own versions of Crockfords, elegant illegal gambling houses that catered to the new industrial elite. These establishments operated openly, protected by political corruption. The police were paid, the politicians were paid, the games were honest, or at least honestly crooked, with a known house edge. It was the same model as Monte Carlo, but with a distinctly American flavour, less aristocratic, more entrepreneurial, and utterly dependent on a network of bribes and kickbacks that made enforcement of gambling laws effectively optional. But America's ambivalence about vice ran deeper than Europe's. The country had been founded in part by Puritans, and that Puritan streak, that conviction that pleasure itself was suspect and that moral legislation could perfect society, never entirely disappeared. The progressive era of the early 20th century brought a wave of reform. Gambling, along with alcohol and prostitution, was targeted for elimination. States that had tolerated or even regulated gambling clamped down. The elegant gambling houses of New York were raided and shut down. Anti-gambling laws proliferated. The result, as with alcohol prohibition, was not the elimination of the vice but its transfer to criminal organizations. The 1920s and 30s saw gambling controlled by the same mobsters who ran bootlegging operations. The games moved to speakeasies, illegal casinos, and backrooms. The profits were enormous, and they flowed into the treasuries of organized crime families. Gambling became one of the primary revenue sources for the mafia, alongside alcohol, drugs, and labor racketeering. The mob understood the casino business instinctively. They knew that the house always wins if the game is structured correctly. They knew that the key was volume, getting as many people to play as often as possible, and they knew that the aesthetic mattered, that people would gamble more and more recklessly in an environment that felt luxurious, that made them feel like winners even as they lost. These were not original insights. They were the same lessons that had been learned in Venice, in London, in Monte Carlo. But the mob applied them with an American efficiency and scale. And then, in the middle of the Nevada desert, in a place where nothing should have been able to grow, a man had an idea that would change everything. His name was Benjamin Siegel, though the world knew him as Bugsy, a nickname he hated because it implied he was crazy. He was not crazy. He was a visionary, and his vision was a city built entirely on the industry of gambling, a city that would take the Monte Carlo model and supersize it, democratize it, and surround it with every other vice and pleasure money could buy. Las Vegas in the 1940s was barely a town. It was a railroad stop, a dusty way station in the Mojave Desert with a few thousand residents, legalized gambling since 1931, a policy adopted by the Nevada legislature in the desperate depths of the Depression to generate any revenue at all, and a handful of small casinos that catered to construction workers from the Hoover Dam and the occasional traveler. It was nowhere, nothing, a place the world had no reason to notice. Bugsy Siegel saw something else. He saw location. Las Vegas was just a few hours from Los Angeles, close enough to draw the Hollywood crowd, far enough to feel like an escape. He saw opportunity. Nevada was one of the few states where gambling was legal, which meant that every dollar spent in a Las Vegas casino was a dollar that would have been spent illegally somewhere else, funneled through mob-controlled operations. Here, it could be done openly, with the blessing of the state. And most importantly, he saw the future. Not small gambling halls, but something grand, something that would compete with Monte Carlo in opulence and exceed it in scale. In 1946, Siegel opened the Flamingo Hotel and Casino. It was not the first casino on what would become the Las Vegas Strip. The El Rancho Vegas and the Last Frontier had opened a few years earlier, but it was the first to fully embrace the vision of the integrated resort. The Flamingo was not just a casino, it was a destination. It had a hotel, a showroom featuring top entertainment, multiple restaurants, a swimming pool, and lush landscaping, a shocking extravagance in the desert. The casino itself was designed to be the glamorous heart of the operation, a space that evoked Monte Carlo with its chandeliers and tuxedo dealers, but was open to anyone with money to spend. The opening was a disaster. It was rushed, incomplete. The hotel wasn't finished. It rained, a rare event in the desert, and the roof leaked. Many of the Hollywood celebrities Siegel had invited didn't show up. The casino lost money. Siegel's investors, a consortium of mob figures from across the country, were not pleased. Within months, Siegel was dead, shot through the window of his girlfriend's Beverly Hills home in a classic mob hit. But the Flamingo survived. Under new management, it became profitable, and it proved the concept. Within a few years, other mobsters and entrepreneurs, often the same thing, began building their own casino resorts on the Strip. The Desert Inn, the Sands, the Sahara, the Riviera, each one trying to outdo the last in theme, in spectacle, in the sheer audacity of building a palace in the desert. The mob poured money into Las Vegas, not just their own money, but money from the Teamsters Pension Fund, a vast pool of capital that union boss Jimmy Hoffa made available to casino developers at favorable rates, often in exchange for hidden ownership stakes. This was illegal, of course, but in Las Vegas, legality was always negotiable. The casinos were fronted by legitimate businessmen, but behind the scenes the money was counted in hidden rooms by trusted mob associates who would skim cash off the top before it was reported to the state for taxation. This skim, the untaxed, unrecorded profit, was then distributed to mob bosses across the country. It was a brilliant system, a legal casino producing illegal profits. Las Vegas in the 1950s and 60s was a unique American creation, a place where the boundaries between legal and illegal, between legitimate business and organized crime, between entertainment and vice, were utterly blurred. It was a company town, and the company was the mob. But it was also, undeniably, a success. Millions of Americans, not just the wealthy elite, began making pilgrimages to Las Vegas. They came for the gambling, yes, but also for the entertainment, the all-you-can-eat buffets, the swimming pools, the sense that for a weekend they could live like high rollers. The casinos perfected the psychological manipulation of their customers. They learned, through trial and error, how to design a space that encouraged gambling. There were no clocks, no windows, nothing to remind you of the passage of time or the existence of the outside world. The lighting was carefully controlled, always flattering, always bright enough to feel energetic but never harsh. The carpets were intentionally garish, designed to keep your eyes up, on the games, on the flashing lights of the slot machines. The layouts were labyrinthine, impossible to navigate in a straight line, ensuring that you passed dozens of gaming opportunities on your way to anywhere. The psychological principles were becoming clearer. The casino was an environment optimized for a specific purpose, to keep you gambling. Everything else, the shows, the food, the rooms, was secondary, a loss leader to get you in the door and keep you on the property. The real profit was always at the tables and increasingly at the slot machines. Slots had been around since the 1890s, simple mechanical devices with 3 spinning reels, but they had been seen as a novelty, a game for women and amateurs, while the men played serious games like craps and blackjack. That changed in the 1960s and 70s as the machines became more sophisticated, more engaging, and more profitable. The introduction of electronic slots allowed for bigger jackpots, more complex games, and most importantly, a faster rate of play. A slot machine could cycle dozens of times per hour, each spin representing a small bet and a small loss. Over time, those small losses added up to massive profits for the house. The mob's control of Las Vegas began to erode in the 1960s. the federal government, through the FBI and the IRS, started to put serious pressure on organized crime. The skim was investigated, prosecuted. High-profile mob figures were indicted. The mob's ability to operate openly in Las Vegas became untenable, but nature, and especially the nature of capital, abhors a vacuum. As the mob was pushed out, a new kind of player stepped in, the corporation. The transformation began with Howard Hughes. In 1966, the eccentric billionaire, living as a recluse on the top floor of the Desert Inn, decided to buy the hotel rather than be evicted. Then he bought another casino, and another. Hughes bought the Sands, the Frontier, the Castaways, the Landmark. He poured hundreds of millions of dollars into Las Vegas, money that was unquestionably legitimate, and in doing so he made casino ownership respectable. If Howard Hughes, one of the richest men in America, was investing in casinos, then casinos were no longer mob businesses. They were legitimate corporate investments. This opened the floodgates. Other corporations, seeing the profitability of the industry, began to enter the market. The 1970s and 80s saw the arrival of publicly traded casino companies, corporations that answered to shareholders and securities, regulators, not to mob bosses. This required a new level of transparency and professionalism. The skim disappeared. The games became more tightly regulated. The Nevada Gaming Commission, which had existed since 1959, but had often looked the other way, became more aggressive in policing the industry. The corporatization of Las Vegas accelerated in the 1990s with the arrival of a new generation of mega resorts, casino hotels so large and so expensive that only major corporations could build them. Steve Wynn, a casino operator who understood both the psychology of gambling and the power of branding, led the charge. In 1989, he opened the Mirage, a $630 million resort that featured a volcano that erupted every evening, a tropical rainforest in the lobby, and Siegfried and Roy's white tigers. It was spectacle on a scale Vegas had never seen. The Mirage was profitable beyond anyone's projections. It proved that there was an almost unlimited appetite for casino entertainment if it was packaged correctly. Wynn followed it with Treasure Island, then the Bellagio, which opened in 1998 with a price tag of $1.6 billion. The Bellagio was not trying to be fun or kitschy. It was trying to be Monte Carlo, an attempt to bring European sophistication to the desert. It had an art gallery with works by Picasso and Van Gogh. It had a fountain show set to opera music. It had a casino floor designed by the same principles as always. No clocks, no windows, but the aesthetic was upscale, refined. Other corporations followed suit. MGM Grand built a massive resort with over 5,000 rooms. The Luxor built a pyramid. New York recreated the Manhattan skyline. The Venetian, opened by casino mogul Sheldon Adelson, recreated Venice, complete with gondolas on an indoor canal. The scale of these projects was staggering, billion-dollar investments that required millions of visitors per year to be profitable. And the visitors came. Las Vegas transformed from a regional gambling destination into a global entertainment capital. Approximately 40 million people visit Las Vegas every year, and while they come for the shows, the restaurants, the clubs, the conferences, they almost all gamble. The casino remains the economic engine that powers everything else. The hotel rooms are often sold at a loss or break-even, subsidized by the expectation that guests will gamble. The buffets, once a famous loss leader, are now often break-even operations. Everything is designed to funnel customers to the casino floor, where the house edge, that small but inexorable mathematical advantage, grinds away, turning hope into profit. The house edge is the secret at the center of the entire industry. It is the reason casinos exist, the reason they are profitable, and the reason they always will be. It is a simple concept. Every game in a casino is structured so that, over time, the house will win more than it loses. The edge varies by game. In roulette, with a single zero wheel, the house edge is 2.7%. In American roulette, with a double zero wheel, it's 5.26%. In blackjack, if you play perfect strategy, the house edge can be as low as 0.5%, but most players don't play perfectly, and the edge climbs to 2% or higher. In slot machines, the house edge can be anywhere from 2% to 15%, depending on the machine and the jurisdiction. This edge seems small, but it is mathematically guaranteed to work over time. If 1 million people make 1 million bets, the house will win a predictable percentage of the total money wagered. Individual players will have winning sessions, of course. Some will have spectacular winning sessions. Those stories will be told and retold. But in the aggregate, over thousands and millions of bets, the math is inexorable. The house will win. It must win. The edge is not a trick, it is the business model. And yet, people keep coming. Why? The answer is complex, rooted in psychology, in neuroscience, in the very structure of the human brain. Gambling activates the same reward pathways that are activated by food, sex, and drugs. When you win, when the slot machine plays its little victory song or the dealer pushes a stack of chips toward you, your brain releases dopamine, a neurotransmitter associated with pleasure and motivation. It feels good. And your brain, which evolved in an environment where resources were scarce and uncertain, is wired to pay attention to potential rewards, especially unpredictable ones. This is called intermittent reinforcement, and it is one of the most powerful conditioning mechanisms in psychology. Laboratory experiments have shown that behavior rewarded on an unpredictable schedule is more persistent, more resistant to extinction than behavior rewarded consistently. A rat that gets a food pellet every time it presses a lever will stop pressing when the pellets stop coming. A rat that gets a pellet randomly, sometimes after one press, sometimes after 100, will press that lever obsessively, far past the point of reason. Gambling is intermittent reinforcement applied to human beings. The wins come unpredictably, and that unpredictability is precisely what makes them so compelling. Modern casinos, with their teams of psychologists and data scientists, have refined this into a science. Slot machines in particular are engineered to maximize what the industry calls time on device, the amount of time a player spends in front of the machine. Every sound, every visual effect, every near miss, where the symbols almost line up, is designed to keep you playing. The machines even pay out in small amounts frequently enough to give you the sense that you're winning, that you're on a hot streak, even as the total amount you've lost steadily climbs. The industry has a term for the ideal customer, the whale, a high roller who will bet enormous sums over extended periods. But the real profit doesn't come from whales. It comes from the millions of ordinary people who visit casinos and lose, on average, a few. $100 each. It's a volume business. The house edge, applied to billions of dollars in total wagers, generates tens of billions in profit. In 2019, before the pandemic, commercial casinos in the United States generated over $43 billion in gaming revenue. Las Vegas alone accounted for nearly $12 billion of that. These are not trivial sums. This is a major American industry. But Las Vegas is no longer alone. The casino, as a concept, has proliferated across America and the world, adapting to local laws and cultures. The next great wave came from an unexpected place: Native American reservations. In 1987, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in California versus a Cabazon band of Mission Indians that states could not prohibit gambling on tribal lands if the state allowed any form of gambling, even charity bingo. This decision, combined with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act passed by Congress in 1988, opened the door for tribes to operate casinos on their reservations. The logic was economic development. Many reservations were among the poorest communities in America, with staggering unemployment and limited opportunities. Casinos offered a path to self-sufficiency. The results were mixed. Some tribes struck gold. The Mashantucket Pequot tribe in Connecticut opened Foxwoods Resort Casino in 1992, and it became one of the largest and most profitable casinos in the world, generating billions in revenue and transforming the tribe from poverty to prosperity. The Mohegan tribe followed with Mohegan Sun, another massive success. In California, tribes opened dozens of casinos, taking advantage of the state's large population and the absence of Las Vegas-style commercial gambling. These casinos followed the Las Vegas playbook: large resorts, multiple restaurants, entertainment venues, and a casino floor designed to keep people gambling. The profits, at least in theory, were used to fund tribal government services, education, healthcare, and per capita payments to tribal members. For some tribes, this model worked spectacularly. For others, located in remote areas or lacking the capital to build competitive facilities, the results were disappointing. And the influx of casino money created its own problems: corruption, internal conflict over how profits should be distributed, and the painful irony that some tribal casinos were being managed by the same non-native companies that had profited from the commercial casino industry. The proliferation of Native American casinos changed the geography of American gambling. Suddenly you didn't need to fly to Las Vegas. There was a casino within driving distance of most major population centres. This convenience drove enormous growth in the industry, but also raised new concerns about problem gambling. And then came the greatest expansion of all, the internet. Online gambling began in the mid-1990s, almost as soon as the commercial internet became accessible to the public. The first online casinos were crude, clunky, operations often based in offshore jurisdictions with minimal regulation. But the appeal was obvious. You could gamble from your living room, at any hour in your pajamas. The barrier to entry, having to physically travel to a casino, was eliminated. All you needed was a computer, an internet connection, and a credit card. The legal status of online gambling was and remains ambiguous in much of the world. In the United States, the Wire Act of 1961, originally passed to target mob bookmaking operations, was interpreted by some federal prosecutors to prohibit all forms of online gambling. In 2006, Congress passed the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, which made it illegal for banks and payment processors to knowingly process transactions for illegal gambling websites. This created a legal grey area. The act of gambling online was not explicitly illegal for the individual player, but the websites and the financial infrastructure supporting them were in legal jeopardy. Many online casinos simply ignored US law, operating from jurisdictions like Antigua, Malta, or Gibraltar, and accepting American customers anyway. The US government responded with prosecutions and domain seizures, most dramatically in 2011 when the Department of Justice seized the domains of the largest online poker sites and indicted their founders. This was the effective end of unregulated online poker in the United States, though the sites continued to operate internationally. But the genie, again, could not be put back in the bottle. In 2018, the Supreme Court struck down the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, which had effectively banned sports betting in most states. This opened the door for states to legalize and regulate sports betting, and more broadly, to reconsider their approach to online gambling. State after state began to legalize online sports betting, online poker, and even online casino games, not because they had suddenly decided gambling was morally acceptable, but because they saw an opportunity for tax revenue. The growth has been explosive. As of 2024, over 30 US states have legalized some form of online sports betting, and several have legalized